Good evening. Let's call the Committee of the Whole meeting for January 10th to order. Please call the roll.
Alderman Strelchek.
Here.
Alderman Bushy.
Here.
Alderman Meyer.
Here.
Alderman Hancher.
Here.
Alderman Garrell.
Here.
Alderman Parrish. Alderwoman Schneider.
Here.
Mayor Nurbin.
Here. First up, we have approval of the meeting minutes from December 13th.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion in the second. Any comments or corrections? Hearing none. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Minutes are approved. Next up, we have a discussion item, so a presentation and then some Q&A at the end of that regarding our compensation study. Take it away, Justin.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to be before you tonight to talk about our class and compensation study that we're in the process of wrapping up the study portion here and moving on to next steps. But before we dive into the study, I wanted to take a moment to quick introduce you to our project manager, Rachel Skaggs. She is from GovHR, and she's a senior vice president with the organization, and she's been working on our study for the past 7 months. And as we kick off, I wanted to just a quick touch on a little bit of the history and overview of the city's compensation processes to date. So back in 2014, the city completed a compensation study that resulted in the current pay plan that's in place now. And then in 2017-18, we implemented a performance-based merit system to start to advance employees through their pay band, and we did a phased implementation through those 2 years, because many staff prior to the creation of the system hadn't had reviews on an annual basis. The city is then, because of the study and the merit system, has been able to provide annual increases to all non-represented staff every year since. Prior to the study, there were years where there weren't increases. So the city's made a conscious effort over the last number of years to look at performance and award staff accordingly. And to continue that effort, we engaged in the current compensation study now to do a market-based analysis to see how we're doing and what we can improve on going forward. So before I quickly turn it over to Rachel here, I just want to mention that after today's session, I'll be bringing forward additional information and the results of the study to the Finance and Personnel Committee for additional review that will ultimately lead towards implementation over the next several months. So without any further ado, I'm going to quick just help switch PowerPoints here, and we'll dive into the study results.
Perfect. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name's Rachel Skaggs with GovHR, Senior Vice President. I've been with the company for about 3 years. Prior to working with GovHR, I spent 10 years in local government in Illinois, most recently as the city manager of Princeton, Illinois. And then prior to that, I worked for the Village of Schaumburg and the Village of Montgomery as well. So my focus at GovHR is classification and compensation studies. That's what I enjoy doing, and it's what I do all day, every day. So happy to have worked on this study and looking forward to kind of going over and sharing the results of the study with you. So I'll just have a short presentation. I'll probably bring up some other things, but feel free to stop me if you have questions as I go through it. So I'm going to talk about the job evaluation that we did, which really led to the proposed classification plan. So really looking at the internal equity within positions in Mequon. And then I'll talk about the compensation survey. And is my microphone? That's okay. And then I'll talk about the compensation survey and the proposed compensation plan, which really looks at the market competitiveness that we surveyed and analyzed. And then I'll go over recommendations for implementation of the plan, and then talk about the future administration of the plan. one thing that's really important when we put together a plan and present it, we want to make sure it's a plan that you're going to be able to use for many years. You're not going to have to do a full study anytime soon, and you can, update it and use it for many years to come. So one of the first things that we did was a job evaluation. And I want to take a quick moment here and just say that, all the employees were really involved in this process. They all had to fill out a job analysis questionnaire. We met with employees virtually. Supervisors reviewed those, and everyone just really did a great job, and it's really great to work with. So we appreciate all the time and effort that all the city employees contributed to this process. It really makes for a good plan when we get that kind of feedback and contribution. So there were 53 positions that we reviewed. And when we review positions, we look at these 9 job factors to establish internal equity. So we look at education, the required preparation and training, work experience, the years of experience needed to perform the job, decision-making and independent judgment, responsibility for policy development, and then also implementation of policies, planning of work, contact with others, work of others, working conditions, and then use of technology and specialized equipment. So each position was evaluated based on the information that we received by the city. So each employee filled out a job analysis questionnaire. Supervisors and department heads reviewed those. However, we always emphasize to supervisors and department heads not to make any changes to what the employees stated, but there's a spot for them to put comments at the bottom if they had additional comments. And then all of those come back to GovHR along with the employee or the position's job description. So we review all of that, and then we have a virtual interview with at least one employee in each position to really expand upon the information that they provided us and learn more about their job. Based on that information, all positions are given a JFA score, which stands for Job Factor Analysis. And then we put together a classification plan to develop internal equity, meaning how positions relate to one another in Mequon. There were also a couple instances where we recommended job title changes, and we'll go over those as well. When you look at table 1 in the report, and I can pull it up here as well, there's 10 grades within the classification plan. So all the grades are separated by 50 points. So positions that fell within those 50 points are in each grade, and that creates the internal equity within those positions. The second component of the study is the external market analysis, or the compensation survey. One of the first things that we did was establish comparable communities. You can see the detail of that in Appendix B, but we looked at these 7 criteria. We looked at population, total equalized value, property tax levy per capita, basic spending per capita, shared revenues, per capita debt, and proximity. So a closer a community was to matching Mequon for each of those criteria, the more points they would receive. Thus, a community with 100 points would be determined to be the most comparable, and so on. So then we sort them and create a cutoff. In this instance, we used 74 points. So communities that received 74 or more points were determined to be most comparable. You can see the list up here on the screen of the communities that received 74 plus points. The ones with an asterisk next to them responded to the survey or supplied GovHR with a copy of their most recent compensation structure. We had a great response rate and had a lot of good data to look at and analyze. So all of the data is collected either through the use of a survey. We use a Google survey, and within that survey, we define each position to make sure we're gathering accurate data. We know that sometimes a community might have a position that's similar, but maybe their job title is a little different. But by reading that kind of brief description of the position, they can still provide us with a position even if the job title is different. And then we review all of the information to determine that it's appropriate for the position that's surveyed. Salary ranges are the preferred method to gather salary data. So you'll see that we also gathered actual salaries, but we really don't use that. We prefer salary range data. We would only use actuals if we didn't have at least 3 range data points for a position. Obviously, with actuals, a lot of things go into that, such as longevity, performance, things like that. So we prefer to use range data. And then one of the things that we did when we collected this data, it's the current market for the position. So to think about when you're going to implement this in 2023, we have increased the proposed recommended ranges by 3% to reflect that. Then the compensation plan is developed. So we developed the compensation rates at the 50th percentile of the salaries of the communities surveyed. And you'll see that on table 2 in the report. So the pay ranges and the pay plans have also been calculated at the 50th percentile, and that is shown in table 3. So overall, there's those 10 grades, and there's 3 bands for each of those. So, and that really just reflects the market and how I'll talk about gradation on the next slide. So grades 1 through 3 are in pay band A, grades 4 through 7 are in pay band B, and grades 8 through 10 are in pay band C. Grades 1 through 7 have a 35% range spread. So that means to get from the minimum to the maximum of the range is 35% different. Grades 8 and 9 have a 40% range spread to get from the minimum to the maximum. And then the next thing I'm going to talk about is gradation. And really all that means is the difference between each grade, and that's to reflect what we saw in the market through that market analysis. So grades 1 through 3 have a 10% gradation, meaning to get from grade 1 to 2, it's 10% different, 2 to 3. Grades 4 and 5 have an 8%, and grades 8 and 9 have a 20%. Once the plan is implemented, these are kind of our recommendations. They can be adjusted, but these are typical recommendations. The first one we always recommend: anyone whose present pay is below the minimum of the range for their classification should be raised to the minimum as soon as possible. Employees whose compensation is within the range for their current classification should be slotted into the new plan at their current rate. This next bullet point doesn't apply, but if it did, or if it does in the future, this would be our recommendation. If there was someone whose compensation is above the maximum of the range, they should be held at their present rate without a reduction in compensation until the market catches up. And then the city can also consider, when the plan is implemented, a one-time longevity increase as part of the implementation. We can help with a recommendation for that increase. There's also a recommendation in the report, but that is completely voluntary and something that the city can consider if they would want to do that at implementation. And then another thing is doing a market adjustment consideration, and that could be done every 5 years based on positions. We obviously know as the economy changes and some positions become, higher demands, you might want to look at the market and consider market adjustments for certain positions. And then future administration of the plan, there's kind of 2 parts. The first part is on the classification side. You want to review positions each year and respond to any changing conditions. So for instance, if a position combined with another position or took on more duties, you might need to rescore that position and make sure they're still in the appropriate grade. GovHR has provided the tools so you can do that in-house, but we're also here and able to help with that if there is a position that needs to be adjusted. So you can create, adjust, or abolish positions as needed. On the compensation side, you want to look and survey the communities annually, or look at CPI each year and adjust the ranges to make sure you're keeping them current with the market. And the survey isn't a full survey like we just did, but a simple survey just to the communities to see what their most recent pay increase has been, take an average of that, and adjust your ranges by that. And then the last one, considering pay adjustments, that again would be if a position has moved grades, taken on more responsibility, or any changes with the positions, you're going to want to look at for pay adjustments and consider those if they're needed. So I know that's a kind of a brief overview. I'm happy to pull up the tables and walk through those unless there's any questions I can take first. If anyone has any.
Alderman Meyer.
Thank you for the presentation. Appreciate that. And thank you for your work on it. So I've noticed that you have inside of there for market, and you have on there for longevity, you have on there. What about performance-based bonuses or?
Yeah. So we would recommend that, similar, I think, to how your current structure is, but correct me if I'm wrong, Justin, that you would continue with your current merit performance-based program, and employees would move through their range based on performance each year. And that's always, our primary recommendation in terms of how to move employees through the ranges, a merit-based system.
Do you recommend anything for, for us doing something on a yearly basis for somebody who's just 10 cuts above everybody else, and we want to, make sure that that person is rewarded for that?
Mm-hmm. So typically we recommend, obviously based on funding, but some type of merit pool, and that might be what you do now. And then within that, how those funds are distributed should be based on performance. And if someone, is really stellar or has done a lot of specific things, you can reward them for that, given if the funding's there.
So you recommend what we're currently doing then in addition to this would be to
Yeah.
market adjust? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I just have a question about our current plan in comparison to the recommendations that are being made here. And this is mostly directed to Justin, but thank you for your presentation. Under our current circumstances, do we have a merit pool, and what percentage of employees get a merit increase in their salary as opposed to just a cost of living increase?
Sure. Let me switch mic. Yeah, so in the current program, the way it works, there is a cost of living increase that serves as the base. Then on top of that, employees can earn up to half of that cost of living on top is the merit. So all non-rep employees are eligible for that. GovHR's study goes a little bit further in recommending that we have the COLA as the base and the ability to earn an additional merit on top of that, more than just a half. And that would vary from year to year depending on the city's fiscal situation. And so it'll be a little bit different if implemented as recommended.
But we, under our current plan, have a defined amount of money that can be used for this purpose, correct? So do
Currently-
we have a merit pool, as she's calling it?
Yeah, we've essentially a merit pool. Yeah, we anticipate what, as part of the budgeting process, what is going to be allocated towards the merit system, and that is then used to adjust the wages based off how staff score on their performances.
And
I
how
think in
many
the-
people
I think
get a
in the
merit?
budget we passed last year was 3%, correct? So that's what you have to work with.
Yep,
Some might
and-
get more if there's more
For this year, we
for merit, but
for this year we just provided a 3% cost living across the board adjustment. There was no merit increase on top of it.
Okay.
Just to clarify here, and to build off of Assistant City Administrator Shinneman's comments, back in 2020 when the pandemic hit, the city was in a cost-cutting mode. And as the council may recall, a 1% cost of living adjustment was applied to all non-represented salaries for 2021. That was what the city could afford at that time, and the pay for performance system was suspended. That carried through into 2022, and a decision was made by the senior executive staff team to carry through that system yet again this year, given the high rate of inflation and the desire not to put employees through a merit evaluation and give them the money that they would otherwise need at 3% versus 8% inflation. Our intention is to get back to that merit-based system going forward. But given with COVID and the inflation environment we've been in of late over the last couple of years, there is no merit pool. And I want to be very clear with the council on that. And we need to keep that in mind as we go forward on this evening's discussion.
Thank you.
Alderman Bushy.
Thank you. This is extremely thorough report and analysis. I appreciate that. Essentially, two questions. One, I think you said that there's nobody that's hit the top of the ranges, but are there others that need to be moved up to the minimum?
I believe so, but I don't remember the exact number, but there were a few that are below that need to be brought up. I will say overall, most positions are within the proposed ranges. I think your salaries are competitive, but there are a few that need to be brought up, but there was no one that was outside of the proposed ranges on the other end, the maximum, I should say.
So then if if your proposals in here were accepted, do we have any estimate of what the overall fiscal impact would be?
That is the information we're working on now, and we'll be bringing to finance and personnel to vet through in the coming months.
Thanks.
You recall we budgeted $50,000 for this next year to make a start towards that, but the detailed analysis is still forthcoming. Alderman Strelchak.
First of all, thanks for all the hard work. I did have one just kind of basic question on proximity. I found that kind of ironic that that was only 10%. I understand as, you know, value within the community, taxable rate and everything else. Our talent pool is going to be more competitive locally than somebody that would maybe move, like, you know, we could lose somebody to Cedarburg or Grafton versus somebody to Middleton. You know, Middleton's a little harder conversion. So what was the justification for the lower percent, or is that just kind of standard overall and it balances out?
Yeah, typically proximity is about 10 points. That's what we use for proximity, just because sometimes depending on your talent pool, they will, you know, drive farther. But you know, population and financial criteria are usually more heavier impacts to comparables than proximity. But that's a good question. So the ones that you use, we have different criteria for each state. So that's the basic criteria that we use for Wisconsin based on the information we can gather.
And then a follow-up question is, what is the coaching on the salary ranges? I mean, obviously we got some of the preliminary, if they're not at the level, you bring them up. If they're above, you just kind of wait for the market to catch up. If you need to do something else, you know, we've talked about that talent pool and things like that. Where do we want to shoot for, like, you know, hey, we're competitive, we've got a good person, they're moving up, you know, systematically. Do they want to be mid-range? Do they want to be top quartile? You know, and then if we struggle to fill a position and we're getting feedback that other sectors or other things are more competitive, what's our kind of go, no-go decision-making process as council? We've struggled with that, I think, in the past. Obviously, we wish to maintain our competitiveness across the board for getting and retaining good talent. But again, we want to do so at a value for the residents that's, you know, market rate or close to it, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really a philosophy of the city, you know, what you want your philosophy to be when you want employees to be at midpoint, or one of the benefits is, you know, having that open range. So if you have a hard to fill position, you have the flexibility of bringing a position in closer, you know, to the midpoint or higher if you need to. But you still have to keep in mind internal equity as well and where positions are within the range too. So that's kind of a philosophy for each community, depending on where they want to be. You know, we've developed the plan at the 50th percentile, which I think is really competitive, but down the road, if, you know, you want to be at a higher percentile, that would be a philosophy change on what percentile you want to be at, depending on if you're having issues recruiting or with the talent pool.
Yeah, so like if we're bringing in an experienced person, we'd maybe shoot to bring them in at that 50th percentile-ish.
So we would always recommend, at least at the minimum, up to the midpoint typically. For extreme situations where maybe you have someone with a lot of experience, you know, they're requesting a higher salary, you can bring them in higher, but we typically recommend between the minimum of the range up to the midpoint.
Great.
Any other questions? Alderman Parrish.
Thank you. Just to reiterate, my peers appreciate the thorough report. I thought it was presented really well, especially our city staff salary. I was going to get to the library, just had some questions there. But as far as what I noticed, it looks like about half of the salaries are pretty good, and about the other 20 to 40% need a slight adjustment just to get them into the lower boundary. Thought it was interesting. It tends to be the public works and engineering departments that were short when I actually looked closely at it. So that was just an interesting trend.
Technical positions, we've seen that with like the market too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I'm comparing this to the library report, and the reason why we asked you to have the library report as part of this is that we've been hearing quite often that they're struggling to keep their librarians, and they don't feel like their pay is competitive, and we're just trying to help them be the best library they can be. And so when I'm looking at this, I don't really see like what are the current salaries. There's like a range being presented, and I can't make the determination how are they doing? How are we doing paying our library people?
So I don't think they currently have ranges, if I remember correctly. So we just had actual data for them, which we didn't include actuals in the report. But I am presenting to them, the library board specifically on this, I think next month, where we'll talk some more about that. If I remember correctly, and I'll have to pull up the spreadsheet.
Page 37 of our packet.
Yeah, do you have the Excel spreadsheet on there by chance? I can see what their actuals are.
I think where ultimately I'm going is maybe the format. I'm not able to draw any conclusions from it, so I don't know that
Yeah.
there's even anything for you to answer here, but we just probably need some additional detail.
Yeah, it might be helpful to have their actual salaries to see which ones are below the range. I think that's what you're getting at, right?
Exactly.
To see how they.
I can't
I think
draw any conclusions.
we are going to get into libraries financials in a little more detail early this year, so I think there's time to get that discussion made before we need to take actions for next year's budget.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Justin and Rachel, are you able to pull up the list of positions that are recommended for a title change? And are you able to pull up a list of the positions that meet that very first criteria in terms of potential adjustment?
Yeah, let's do the title change first. So table 1, oh geez, there we go. So table 1 lists that classification grouping that I talked about. So 50-point spread on the skill level, the grade the positions are in, and then in this column you'll see if there's a recommended job title change. So when we get down here to grade 4, you'll see that we recommended 2 title changes: highway foreman, sewer foreman changing to highway section supervisor, sewer section supervisor. And typically when we recommend job title changes, it's to be, one, it could be changes that we see when we did the interviews that are more representative of the position, or 2, changes that we see with the market. So more reflective of job titles for the same position in the market. Down here, records clerk, record specialist. And that's it. So those are the 3 recommended job title changes. And then the ones that were requested to be brought up, I have that on the Excel, but I don't know if you want to pull it up. Okay.
I'll pull it up real quick.
Yep.
And while Rachel's pulling up the Excel sheet, I just want to quick add with the title changes. I'll be working with each department to see their perspectives on the suggested title and if we need to consider something different. So that'd be another item that'll be coming forward to finance and personnel as we work through implementation.
I have a question.
Alderman Schneider.
So are these title changes mainly to bring them into more modern terminology so that we're talking the same title with other folks, or is there a change in actual duties of these people? I mean, were we not describing what they do accurately, or is it just updating the verbiage so that it's more consistent with the market?
Yes, so for the sewer section supervisor and the other supervisor, it was instead of using foreman. We typically don't recommend that, especially since there's a lot of women in those positions now.
Gotcha.
And then the record clerk to record specialist was more just not clerk duties. It was more of like a record specialist, so additional duties beyond just clerical duties.
I think those titles were stuck in the 1980s, probably when we created them.
One sec, and I'm going to answer your other question in one.
And just to clarify, these are the positions that would be below the pay range that's otherwise recommended as part of the new plan. So existing position, but they now require adjustment to correspond with the newly recommended and adopted compensation plan.
Okay, yep, I think I have it. Okay, so these are the positions that, oh yeah, I see what you're gonna do, perfect. Then you could pull them up on here so I don't have to read them all. So ones in green here, I'll just go down the list, are ones that are below the proposed minimum, some just slightly, others a little more. So assistant city administrator, assistant city engineer, building superintendent, building with the 2023, that one is within range now. One second. Executive assistant communications, accounting specialist, building maintenance worker, for some forestry workers, highway workers. Again, you'll see most are just within 1 to 2,000 below the proposed. Sewer maintenance worker, accounts receivable specialist, admin assistants in a couple divisions, admin clerks. So most are just right below that, but there are quite a few that fall right at the minimum of the range.
And getting back to your report, that should be the first area, or that's recommended to be the first area of focus for the city,
Absolutely.
is bringing those individuals up to the revised pay range for those positions.
So that would definitely be our recommended step one of implementation. So first consider getting anyone below minimum up to the minimum. And then after that, it can be based on your needs if you want to look at merit or longevity or how you want to proceed from there.
Terrific. Thank you.
Mhm.
Assistant City Administrator Shinneman, would you be able to just provide the council with an overview of the next steps that we're looking to follow coming out of tonight's workshop meeting?
Yeah, happy to. So after tonight, we'll be looking to bring the study's findings and the data to finance and personnel over the coming months, where we'll review the information a little bit more in-depthly and talk about implementation processes and potentially phasing it in over the X number of months or longer, depending on the committee's direction. Once we have that refined with the committee, we'll be looking to bring it forward to the Common Council for ultimate adoption of the new salary structure and plan to implement.
Fantastic, thank you. And great report. It really, the methodology is thorough, it's easy to understand. I like that we've got tools to adjust as we go forward. I think our last plan, we got a plan and it slowly went out of date over time. We just got to the point where we needed another plan, but I think you've provided the tools. We'll be able to keep it more up to date as we go. And it's certainly more consistent with what I'm used to seeing in the private sector. It's well-defined grades. It's easy to understand. There's the ranges, and it's out there for everyone to understand. It's pretty easy to wrap your head around it.
Great, thank you. And also, again, thanks to the employees, and Justin's put a lot of time and effort into this, and it works better when we have that type of participation. So we want it to be a plan you can use for many years.
Any other questions? Alderman Hancher.
This one is probably for Justin. You talked about implementation. How are the employees going to find out about how this system works? So everybody's on the same page, making sure that they understand the new system, the compensation model, so that there's no everybody has the same understanding.
Yep, so there's going to be conversations held amongst our department head groups. There's going to be conversations amongst all divisions and across the city So we'll be working through implementation and meeting with all staff to let them know the results and ultimately the direction of implementation we're taking throughout 2023.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? If none, thank you, and we'll move on. And if we have questions, we can always, we know where to reach you.
Yes, I'm available.
Next up, we have ordinance 2022-1633. Ordinance amending Chapter 58 of the Mequon Municipal Code regarding the establishment of banquet facilities as conditional uses in the B2 Community Commercial District and Town Center and Arrival Corridor districts. Is it Assistant Administrator Zader going to take this one? Assistant Director, sorry.
Sure.
Just got a new title.
Yes.
New titles for everyone.
Thank you. Yes, this was a request actually from an applicant on Port Washington Road who was actually looking to do a banquet facility and potentially a convention center at their buildings at 10500 and 10520 North Port Washington Road. This is the building that's directly north of the New Life Storage Building. So she paid for the text amendment and requested the change. Staff went and looked at not just this district, but all of our districts to determine whether this would be an applicable use in other districts. And at the time of this came forward, we decided that we would split the convention center and the banquet hall, banquet and reception hall uses into two separate classifications because we felt that certain uses would be better off in our commercial corridor, but not maybe in our business park. So what we ended up doing was allowing banquets and reception halls in both the B2, the town center and the Arrival Corridor, and then the convention and conference center in the B2, B4, and Uleo Creek mixed use district. We also added definitions for both of these two uses and then a parking requirement. This went to Planning Commission and was recommended 8-0 on October 17th. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Alderman Schneider.
I'm just curious as how you determined which of these would be most appropriate in these districts because they have similar parking. Some of them would be similarly sized, I imagine, buildings. So what were the criteria you used to determine which should be allowed in both and which should be allowed only in one or more of the districts?
So the B2 is a hybrid district. It has retail, commercial, as also has office. So we felt they were both appropriate in that district, but the B4 is our business park zoning. So there's only office there. So we didn't feel like a banquet facility with entertainment venue would be really appropriate in that location. And then our town center and our Arrival Corridor, that's a commercial retail area. We didn't feel that convention or conference center would be appropriate there as well. So we kind of looked at what the primary function of each district was to determine whether each of those two uses would be suitable in those districts. It was more about how they fit in that versus the parking and all the other demand.
Thank you.
Alderman Meyer.
I'm in favor of the concept of this whole thing of doing that and having those designations. Number one, I've got an issue with having it in the Arrival Corridor. The Arrival Corridor was originally set up so that it would be lesser intense, smaller, and working towards the town center. And that's the way that this was all set up originally. 12,000 square foot banquet centers inside. I don't think there's a small lead up to the town center inside of it. And so that was the original concept when we started this whole town center issue in doing that. So we had that section so it'd be less intense. So number one, I think that we should leave, and I'll make a motion to take the Arrival Corridor out of that. The other thing is that always kind of bugs me a little bit is the fact that every time we do something like this, it's always under the conditional use. And I think that these are so much intertwined, the convention and conference center or banquet center. I mean, because either one could be used for either function, actually. I mean, when you take a look at what's out there and read classifications on the website or whatever you want to do for it. I really think we need to go back and take a look at this and put some hardcore yes and no's that you can do inside of these things, and just make it and not make it a conditional use, just make it a permitted use for the area. What happens is most of the time, as you know as well as I do, is when we make something a conditional use, there's always kind of fringe things, and then the state takes over and say you can't do this or you can't do that, and because it's a conditional use. But if it's permitted use or not a permitted use inside of there, what they're allowed to do, then we've got a little more.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the biggest issue of making it conditional use is that we can set and limit the hours of operation. That's usually the biggest issue. If it's a permitted use, then it would fall back to the district hours of operation. And many of our business, like our B2, our B3, B4, they don't have hours of operation requirements. So if we had say a wedding venue or banquet facility in one of those districts, and it's a permitted use, we couldn't regulate the hours of operation, and they could go on until 2 in the morning, and that might not be appropriate for some of the areas that are abutting other single family. Other zoning districts like Town Center do have limitations in their hours of operation, so that's less of an issue. But that's probably the primary reason. You're right with the way the state law is now. You can't really limit a lot of the conditional uses, but hours of operation is one of the key driving criteria that we can use to limit the impacts on any surrounding properties. That's the main reason we keep them as conditional.
But it does leave us open for all the other stuff, though.
I'm not sure I follow that.
Well, I mean, if there's no any other conditions we put on top of that.
You can add other conditions. You just have to have some legal basis for those conditions. It's a little bit harder than it used to be, but we still can if we can make the case that the conditions relative to protecting the residents of the surrounding area, we can still make that case. But with a permitted use, it becomes a lot more difficult to do that, especially if you have a district that's abutting, again, single family or in a close proximity to single family. It's nicer to have those conditional uses that way. If there's a future problem, then you could revisit those conditional use criteria at a planning commission if it becomes an issue.
And my other question is why, and I'm going to make a motion to remove it, but why would you have inside of a arrival corridor, which is supposed to be a less intense area, why would you have that a 12,000 square foot one instead of having the other way around?
Arrival corridor typically is allowed in other types of uses is allowed to have bigger types of buildings. We wanted the town center to be more small scale retail with smaller size retail spots. So we have limitations of 2,000, 3,000 square feet for certain uses. As you get in the arrival corridor, we allow for larger scale buildings. I can see it both ways. It's that was the decision we made when we did that. If you're not comfortable with it being an arrival corridor, that's an option. As you go further west there, you do come closer to other residential properties, but the finial is for sale. That would be probably a nice facility for that type of use in that building, and that's currently zoned arrival corridor.
No, I know that area is, but it's right up next close to Solar Heights. We've got, the condos across the street from over there, although we do have Outpost Foods over there, but we do have Concord Places close by, stuff like that. And I'm not sure that's an appropriate area for that at all.
That's why I would recommend keeping it a conditional use, so then we could further regulate it if it's an issue versus permitted.
I'd make a motion for approval, but eliminating the arrival corridor out of the ordinance.
Second. Agree.
There's a motion and a second. Further comments, Alderman Strelchak?
Yeah, I just, I'm commenting just kind of for the group here, just from my experience, once it's a permitted use, they have a right. And the right comes in the way that they interpret it, unless we've spelled it out otherwise. Conditional use means you have the option. What I've seen come in for conditional use has either been something that just wouldn't even be in consideration, and then we can rule out immediately based on reasonable, conditions, or we can add conditions to make it reasonable. So the conditional use, given the flexibility and the hours and everything else, it really gives us the opportunity to make sure that we can permit it with reasonable conditions, but protect the community integrity, protect the community value, and protect the neighbors, and residents nearby, as Alderman Meyer's asking for, kind of by eliminating the arrival corridor here. So if the discussion would go further as to whether it be a permitted or a conditional, I would prefer to leave it a conditional. If we want to button it down, which is I think where Alderman Meyer's kind of talking about, as to like really what it means, and have pre-listed criteria that they absolutely need to meet to be considered a conditional use. We can have upfront criteria that would be legal within the state of Wisconsin listed out, and I would be also supportive of adding, those conditions to, consideration for the conditional use. I've seen things turn into what I would call an art show, you know, where everyone's kind of analyzing and this is how I feel versus really kind of looking at it as a general business decision and a community decision, whether, you know, it's fit based on this or not. I do like avoiding the, you know, a lot of the personal opinion. I like to have it more quantitative for the applicants. I think it encourages good quality applicants, and I think that they know the conditions and it can put forth a better business plan. So, you know, there's just a little insight as to how I think through this and what I feel might be appropriate moving forward.
Alderman Parrish.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with a lot of what Alderman Strelczyk just said relating to conditional uses. It's critical we keep that there. Thank you for not including that in your motion, Alderman Mayor. And I think it's, I'm not sure why we're differentiating the arrival corridor for this use over some of the others. I mean, I don't think it's that much closer to residential than other districts. So if anything, I'm kind of more supportive of taking a closer look, like Alderman Strelczyk said, about the standards and what we're really looking to do. And maybe it is that 12,000 square feet is too large. That is fairly large now that I'm thinking about it. You know, and in some of the other places, we, like in the retail and services corridor, for some reason we went with 8,000 square feet or less, I believe, for this use. So like in my mind, it would actually be flipped, the logic. So I'm sorry, I'm just bringing this up now. I was actually at the Planning Commission meeting when we talked about this. It's gone through the first reading and now this. I guess Alderman Meyer, I didn't know you felt that way about this topic, and I'm worried about over correcting this issue without studying it further, I guess. So I'm not sure what that means as far as my vote. I don't want it to fail. Ultimately, it needs to pass, but I kind of think this should be in there.
Can we vote on the amendment separately?
Well, is the hang up the size of the use in the arrival corridor?
I just don't get why we're removing it. I mean,
well, you could remove it, and you could
anything, it
always
should be
add
out
it
of the
later and
Creek
study it
corridor
more
then.
before you add it
It's out
back
of
in.
the arrival corridor. So there are some inconsistencies here. And
Make a reasonable motion, I'll second it
You
for an
could
amendment.
also split the
Committee of the
question,
whole.
because you do technically have two issues there. You could split that question, approve the motion, approve the full as presented, and then the amendments. You could do that, or you could make a motion to amend in some way specifically.
Alderman Meyer.
Well, could we could, I mean, approve this, eliminating the rebel corridor with having it go back to the planning commission and have them take a look at that again for the size and that and the requirements in that area.
Yeah, I mean, there's no pending application for the arrival corridor. This was driven by the request for the B2, so I don't see anything coming forward. And if somebody does, they could always request it as well. But I don't see an issue of just taking it out and revisiting the issue at planning commission too.
Do we have a motion?
Do a motion and a second.
There's a motion to approve it with the removal of the arrival corridor. So I think that would, if we wanted to go that route, we could get 80% of this done tonight, and we could always send the arrival corridor portion back to the planning commission.
I'd actually like to remove Uleo Creek too, if we're doing arrival corridor.
I'd actually like to
I don't
approve the whole
differentiate
thing
them.
and then talk about the restrictions afterwards in separate amendments. I'd rather approve it as a concept and as something we want to do in our city, is have allow these uses and then separately discuss whether or not we want to amend different portions of it. I think this is overall a good idea, and I think I would like to hear a little more discussion about the Uleo Creek arrival corridor, what sizes might be appropriate to restrict, et cetera, and still be able to move forward with the concept of this ordinance.
It says
What is that?
that's a different motion.
Yeah.
No.
Slightly. Alderman Strelczyk.
So what are you saying? Like,
Well, I think I'm just concerned that
how do we want to
to
accomplish
then
this?
only having Uleo Creek be a separate discussion. I
What-
think this is
I think what I heard is you'd like
to approve.
arrival corridor and Uleo Creek removed, and those both could go back to the planning commission for further vetting and study.
That would be fine. I
And-
just think we should at least approve the ordinance
for the
tonight
appropriate areas that are
for the
on the
areas that are
document.
not contentious for these other Alderman.
Yeah,
I
B2,
seconded that
B4, and
motion.
town center, yeah.
I would accept that. Would you, Alderman Meyer?
So you just want to approve B2 and B4
And town center.
Down south.
And town
and
center.
town center? Yeah, I can accept that
And
as a
then it-
friendly amendment.
I mean, I'm fine with it all, but I think we should at least approve what we can approve tonight.
So the mover is amenable to, as the seconder also amenable to it? Okay. So that's what we have before us. Any further discussion on the item? I guess anyone who's got feedback on those two districts before we send it back to planning commission, please provide your input to staff so we can roll that in to kind of feed the discussion, because there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about this at planning commission, but that might help them stimulate more thoughts and discussion on the item and help us get farther down the road. I think there's probably a place for it in those districts, just to what extent is I think what we're getting hung up on. Is that generally correct? Okay.
Call the vote.
No further questions. We'll call the vote on the motion as amended and friendly amended.
Alderman Strelchak,
Aye.
Alderman Bushy,
Aye.
Alderman Meyer,
Aye.
Alderman Hancher,
Aye.
Alderman Garrell,
Aye.
Alderman Parrish,
Aye.
Alderwoman Schneider,
Aye.
Aye.
Mayor Nordman.
I still get to say something at this meeting.